Welcome to Conversations with Coleman. My guest today is Sam Harris, neuroscientist, author of The End of Faith, Waking Up, The Moral Landscape, Free Will, Lying, podcaster extraordinaire, and one of my personal heroes. Thank you for being on the show, Sam.
Oh, well, thanks for jumping into this. It's great to you are one of my personal heroes now as well, as you may know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm happy to inaugurate your podcast. I don't know how many episodes you've done. How deep are you into the recording at this point?
You're my third,
Uh-huh.
but I'm
Cool.
probably
All
going to
right.
release you first.
All right. Well, happy to be here.
Yeah. So I was thinking we would start off by talking about reparations, if that's okay with you.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. Well, I don't. This is a topic that I think is genuinely difficult, about which I don't have a settled opinion. So
mhm.
my mind is unusually open on this topic.
Yeah, and my mind is, I think, more open than you would expect it to be. I've evolved in my thinking on this issue even in the past 2-3 weeks, just having had so much time to think about it, having gotten so much feedback. Obviously, I think my fans will know that I testified before Congress a few weeks ago against reparations. I was one of 8 testifying. You can see the video on YouTube. And testifying for reparations for Bill H.R. 40 was Ta-Nehisi Coates, Danny Glover, and many others. And then it was myself and one other person testifying against. And that went pretty viral. I think that went more viral than anything that I've said or written.
Right.
And a lot of the backlash was pretty ugly. It was a public shaming of a degree that I haven't really experienced before. And I want to talk about public shaming in general later because you're a veteran of that territory.
Yes.
But
Having been shamed. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think we should talk about reparations first. And I think you can go back and look at what I said and what I've written about it in Quillette. But I think one mistake I made was, I guess, trying to think about reparations with the logical half of my brain more than the emotional half, because I think, I think, you know, slavery and Jim Crow for many people just feel like an open wound. Feels like just something as a nation we have not yet gotten closure about, and we can
Mhm.
talk about why that is, but that just is a fact, I think, at this moment. And the goal that I completely share with people who want reparations is to feel like slavery and Jim Crow are somewhat closed wounds, that the scar is healing nicely, so to speak. The question is, how do we get there? And I want your opinion on this. Do you see that as the goal, and do you see reparations? If so, do you see reparations as a way to get there?
Well, again, with the caveat that I haven't thought a lot about this, and I really have, I do not have a settled opinion on it. It seems to me that there's a fairly straightforward ethical case for it. I mean, there's this obvious injury that you can bound historically in at least to a first approximation, and you can link it up with a fairly obvious debt. I mean, you can make some argument about the amount of wealth that was created, and we have the history of wealth inequality that followed. It's something. It's not nearly as clean as a more contemporaneous injury, like what you're paying reparations for Holocaust survivors in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, say. But it still is. It's fairly easy to pinpoint the moral problem. I think it's very hard to make a practical case for it, and I think it's impossible at the moment to make a compelling political case for it. I mean, just to take the immediate concern of the next presidential election, my gut intuition is that pushing for reparations now for among the Democrats is just a guaranteed way to get Trump elected for 4 more years. I think it's a political non-starter that's not going to prevent certain Democrats from attempting it. But so even if at the end of a long conversation, I could say I'm for reparations. I'm not for reparations in this election cycle, just
Mm,
because I think it will guarantee Trump. So
mm.
that's the. So I think those are separable pieces. As far as yeah, I mean, it's just the ethical case is pretty clear. It's just the issue you get into is that immediately bleeds into the practical case. I mean, who pays and who gets paid, right? And how? Like what are reparations in this case? And what are we actually correcting for? Are we correcting for the ambient level of racism that still exists to the disadvantage of African Americans, or are we correcting for identifiable theft of for people who are the descendants of slaves? You know, and I mean, so there are many people who are black who probably inherit, who certainly inherit whatever consequential racism still exists, but they aren't descended from slaves, right? They're immigrants, or their parents were immigrants. Uh, so how you reconcile all of that? I mean, that's very difficult.
Yeah, so I like that you separate this into the ethical conversation and the practical conversation. I think most supporters of reparations limit themselves to the ethical part of the conversation, clearly because they have a better case there. But there have been some, like the economist Sandy Darity, who have pretty persuasively worked out the practical side as well. He has a plan for how to determine who gets it, and he sort of worked out many of the kinks in a
Mm.
way that at least makes me feel, as someone who still opposes most versions of reparations, that I can't win the argument on the practicalities alone. But then there's this third part, which is political, about which I completely agree with you. I mean, I think there's something crazy about being blindsided by things over and over again. So I was someone who was blindsided by Trump's victory, absolutely blindsided, and extremely distraught. And I think we have to learn the lesson to not do things that are going to get us blindsided again in 2020. I think reparations is clearly one of those things, given how unpopular it is. But I want to wind it back to the ethical conversation for a second. Clearly, if we're talking about reparations for slavery, well, let me wind it back a second. Reparations in general, I think, are owed to the specific victims of a crime, or
Mm.
something that was not defined legally as a crime at the time, but we look back on with horror. So, but it's less clear to me that reparations are owed to the grandchildren, for example, of uh, of of a Holocaust survivor, even if that Holocaust survivor weren't paid at the time and should have been. And given that what do you think of that? I think the median African American in America is like 33 years old, right? Born
Mm.
in the 80s, right? Do you observe that distinction, or do you think because it wasn't paid to my grandfather that in principle I inherit what was not given to him?
Well, there just is this counterfactual case where had your grandfather had the average level of economic opportunity and wealth accrual of a white person in his generation, uh, well, then there would have been more inheritance. There would have been something passed down, presumably. And if in your case it wasn't, I mean, you can draw a fairly straight line there. And again, there's the other side of the ledger always here. There are white people, there are black people who are doing great. There are white people who are doing terribly. And because the moment you start talking about reparations, there's a there's a demand to focus on what problem are you actually trying to solve in the present, right? It's like if uh, should middle class and wealthy African Americans get reparations when you can point to uh, millions of people in other groups who are doing badly, they're just certainly worse off than they are, and if you simply looked long enough, you would find disparities in bad luck or historical contingencies that accounted for why they were doing badly. I mean, so there's an obvious question about where this stops, right? Because there's so many groups that have been treated badly. Again, the injury is not as salient as slavery and its aftermath, but I mean, the Native Americans obviously have a case. Like what reparations are they owed? Um, and that the history of colonialism will volunteer various cases, right? We can look at all of our misadventures the world over and ask, what is owed to Africa for the centuries of pillage there. So there is a concern about where it stops, but you sort of have that concern whenever you try to right any wrong, right? So that's not really a knockdown argument against doing this. You can't have the perfect be the enemy of the good here. But it's a hard case for me because, I mean, so the politics creeps in here too, because the people who are arguing for reparations, I mean, someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, I mean, most of them, many of them, certainly Coates, I view as bad faith actors. I mean, they're just not honest brokers of the ethical principles here, and you get the sense that either, I mean, just imagine imagine the day after the fullest payment of reparations that's conceivable, right? Then what happens? I mean, Coates certainly seems capable of saying, if you think you can buy us off with a check of that size, of any size, you've got another thing coming, right? Like, so the goalpost will move, and then you're left with the question, well, what was any of this for, right? If the wound of slavery can't be healed with anything as crass as whatever it would be, a $6 trillion check.
Yeah.
That's another concern.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I want to wind it back to the counterfactual. If not for slavery, Jim Crow, black people would have more wealth. I think that's a very supportable statement. I think, on average, it's clear that slavery, Jim Crow, especially policies like redlining, had a long-term effect on the median black person's wealth, even in 2019. The question is how much of the wealth gap would be closed if history had gone differently, more fairly. I tend to assume that, I've read a lot of Thomas Sowell and been very persuaded that disparities, indeed large disparities, are the norm rather than the exception. And often it's the case that the group that's discriminated against has more wealth than the group that discriminated against it. And with wealth, the example I always give is that there's a study from the early 2000s that showed the median Jewish household to have 7 times the wealth of the median conservative Protestant household. And I think many people aren't sensitive to, or many people I think naively assume that in the counterfactual everything would be the same. But that aside, I think it's clearly true that black people would have more wealth than they do now if history had gone differently. The reason that I don't think of this in terms of the counterfactual so much is because I think it's kind of beside the point. I think so. For instance, if we're going to start doing counterfactual thinking, then we kind of have to do counterfactual thinking across the board. And then you get led to very repugnant conclusions very quickly. For example, where would I be if not for slavery, quote unquote, hypothetically, right? I would have been born in West Africa rather than in New Jersey, right? Does that mean slavery was good for me? No, I mean, that's just the wrong way to think about it, in my view.
Right.
Because it's just, besides being a kind of icky way of reasoning, I'm not sure it's a very useful way of reasoning. And I think
presumably you wouldn't even exist, right?
Right.
I mean, it's not.
Right.
It's
Right.
I mean, almost nobody could say that everything would be the same except they would have been born in another country, right?
Right, right. But turning to this point, which is one I really agree with, and one that John McWhorter made as well, is the goalposts are constantly shifting on the way we tell the narrative of what America has done to try to make up for slavery. When we
Right.
instituted affirmative action, which is still ongoing, giving black people a leg up in college admissions, diversity and inclusion programs in various sectors of the labor market. If you're a minority business owner, there are set aside programs that will allocate government contracts specifically for people like you, giving you. All of this is in the spirit of making up for the past, even though it's sometimes, we've sort of had to had to shift the rationale to diversity because perhaps because people are uncomfortable with making the case for reparations, but even Ta-Nehisi has written in The Atlantic that the diversity rationale doesn't make that much sense to him for affirmative action. Really, what makes sense is the redress for history
Hmm.
rationale, and the reason I've kind of gotten away from the counterfactual way of thinking is I do view this as and also the reason why I tend to not think anymore in terms of comparisons to other examples of reparations is because I guess I'm less concerned with the principles involved and more concerned with getting to a place where this feels like a closed wound for people. And I
Yeah.
think of the analogy of a person who has experienced some terrible trauma, sometimes often in childhood. We all have, I'm not one of these people, but you know, I know people who experienced a terrible trauma in childhood and really reconciled with it to the point where they're not thinking about it all the time. They've really gone through what it takes to get past it. And then I know other people who experienced a trauma and as elderly people still talk about it almost every day, interpret their entire lives through the lens of this trauma that happened to them, and clearly have gotten no closure about it whatsoever. And my, the difference between the first person and the second person, it seems to me, isn't so much about what the world did or did not give them, but much more about the way they reframed their own history. So I think
Yeah.
that I think that whenever reparations are whatever reparations means, and people are very quick to say it's not just a paycheck, it's much more. Other people will say it is a paycheck. So there's a way in which reparations is talked about, kind of like I think of the analogy of the briefcase from Pulp Fiction, where you never get to see what's
Right.
in it, but
Right.
it's
Right.
amazing
Yeah.
and it's the best thing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when whatever that is paid, I do not think. I think you're completely right that Coates and others will say, and not completely without reason, how dare you put a dollar value on slavery and Jim Crow? They'll be able to muster a considerable amount of moral outrage, I think, just at the prospect of it. And I think, and frankly, I think it will be worse because I've heard from a lot of conservative fans of mine, often white conservative fans of mine, who actually do like the idea of reparations because they want to do it once and then they want to be able to say, "Damn it, you have been paid. Can you stop complaining about racism now? Can we please move on to another subject?" That's what I hear sometimes, and the
Yeah.
combination of that plus the heightened moral outrage at having slavery monetized in this way, I think is going to be a combination that makes race relations worse rather than better.
Right. Right. Well, the comparison between the two people, real or hypothetical, uh, one of whom it seems totally resilient, and I mean, even in the extreme case, there are people who are clearly made stronger and more functional based on some early trauma,
Mhm.
right? Uh, and then there are people who, as you say, whose lives are just diminished by it up until their dying day. You can draw that analogy to groups and to perhaps whole cultures, right? So there are cultures, not all cultures are telling themselves stories that render them equally resilient or creative in the face of various crises, right?
Mm.
Now, this is just a kind of generic statement, which virtually has to be true. I mean, it's practically a tautology. If culture is doing anything to help or harm people in terms of how they function, and we have different cultures that are not, running precisely the same software, well, then you're going to see differences in that respect. Um, and I think we're right to worry that there is a kind of uh, religion of victimhood emerging on the left, which of necessity has taken in more people of color, or a disproportionate number of people of color. But as you said at the beginning, uh, you know, I believe you said this at the beginning. Maybe this is a point that you and I are both familiar with, that the most woke people, the people who are most trumpeting, this victimology, are well-educated white liberals at the moment.
Mhm.
But there are memes now that are enshrining victimhood in a way that seems quite unhelpful.
Mhm.
And you see people who, just as you don't like to see people who are endlessly, indelibly defined by the moments in their lives where they were victims, you don't want to see whole cultures defining themselves in those terms. So yeah, I think the argument for reparations would be if it held out a promise to actually reset this whole attitude with respect to the burden of the past.
Mm.
I mean, either we are effectively canceling the burden of the past, or we're not. And if it's hopeless to even try, well then let's not you know uh, open the other wounds that would be opened, or the create wounds that would be created by trying against the will of surely some considerable number of people.
Yeah, it strikes me there's an analogy to apologies here, which is something I've heard you talk about more and more recently. What is an apology? If I say something to my girlfriend that really hurts her, right? And I
Right.
apologize for it. I expect it if it's sincere, it gets accepted, and then I'm kind of brought back to zero, right? It's like there's
Yeah.
no more, there's no, she's not going to hold that against me tomorrow. I mean, and that's the idea. When it works well, that's the idea. It's like really, I
Yeah.
really realized what I did wrong, and then we get to a place where we're healthy about the situation. We're both mentally healthy. We have no resentments because we went through it. We really did it. But it seems that I mean, one point I brought up, I think I did in my testimony, is that the Senate and the House have both did formally apologize for slavery and Jim Crow in 2008 and 2009, kind of sort of under the radar. But at the time there was a black president, you might think that this was the perfect moment, in a sense, to kind of close the door, not close the door on history in the sense of ignoring it, but in the sense of our emotional relationship to it.
Right.
But it didn't happen, and it's not clear to me that the people demanding an apology are playing by the rules of apologies, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and also in this case, who is apologizing? So if you're talking
Hmm.
about reparations, if you're talking about money that has to come out of the pockets of every non-African American uh, American, uh, that is a material uh, demand that is being made on people who were not alive during slavery, or even Jim Crow, and um, many of whom don't feel at all personally culpable for what happened in the past. And the question is, why should they? Right? I mean, if you're talking about people who are um, it's hard. You either, I mean, it's hard to know what it means to own the past as the past recedes, right? And if you can, insofar as there's an economic argument, if you can say, well, listen, you are a beneficiary of whatever, this corporation is a corporation that used slave labor. We can, and now, this corporation is now worth billions of dollars, and we can point to the people who lives have been made better on the basis of all this wealth. that's a material debt that, whether or not anyone alive today would have sanctioned the use of slave labor, presumably not, you still benefited from it, there's a transfer of wealth that makes moral sense here. But what someone like Coates seems to want is a vivid, epiphany on the part of every living white American that they are culpable. We are culpable for a persistent level of racism that is totally intolerable and that explains all of the inequality and is of a piece with the darkest part of our history, and that on some level no gains have been made, and to cite any specific obvious gains. I mean, to say something, to be a white person and say, well, listen, we had a two-term black president. What's going to count as overcoming racism? I voted for Obama twice. I gave money to his campaign. I was all in on the prospect of having a first black president, and then I wanted him reelected, right? So is that white guy really culpable for the primal sin of racism that Coates wants to redress? It's a hard case to make, but this is where all the bad faith comes in. It gets made because it's a hard case to make. It gets made dishonestly.
Yeah. There's another part to and we'll get off this soon, but the last part that I hear often from advocates of reparations is the idea that we have yet to acknowledge our history. That part of what is meant, if not most of what is meant by reparations, is a serious interrogation of our past as a country. The idea being that what most white people think happened is we fought a civil war, and ever since 1865, black people were roughly treated equally. And what we need to do is really correct our history and knock over all of the resistance that white people allegedly feel to honestly acknowledging that slavery and Jim Crow happened, and that many of the specific policies constituted like an extraction of wealth. And when I heard that, when I hear that argument, what I think to myself is, in the 10,000 year history of slavery, slavery is as old as civilization, has been practiced in nearly every civilization, on almost every continent, on every inhabited continent, in fact. What I think to myself is, I don't think there's a single example of slavery that has been more studied than American slavery between the 17th century and 19th century. And what that suggests to me is that our failure to get past race which is a goal that not everyone shares, and we can talk about that. It's not going to be helped by further study of the past. And as much as I like history personally, and I find history to be fascinating, this idea that we need to delve deeper into the past as a primary means of sort of reconciling ourselves as Americans doesn't hold water for me.
Yeah, well, it's there's no end in sight if you go down that path. I would agree with that. It's again, if you have an identifiable injury that is easily bounded, right, where you can say, like, this is your parents did this to my parents, and here are the effects, right? Like you dumped toxins on our land, and it's going to cost $1 million to clean it up, right? Like those are debts that people and even previous generations can incur to others, and so I wouldn't want to close the door to reparations on the basis of past grievances that were formed in the past, just across the board. But again, it's just with something this big and this complex and this old, right? It's hard to see how it could ever really make moral or practical sense.
Hmm.
That you um, and then you're still you'll be left with the present, right? You're left with persistent inequality of various types in the present, which uh, as you point out in your writing, and I believe you mentioned here briefly, there are all kinds of inequalities that we never think to try to remedy, right? I mean, if you go looking for group differences, if you look at how uh, you know, Polish Americans compared to French Americans in their economic well-being, right? You're going to find a difference,
Hmm.
right? I don't remember who's on top there, but um, you know, any group that finds itself below a significant number of other groups could say, listen, there's got to be something fairly sinister that explains this because
Hmm.
I wake up every day, trying to gather as much wealth as possible. Uh, and as a French American, it galls me that I've got the Indians and the Nigerians and the Polish above me,
Hmm.
right? Um, no one would take that seriously, right? I mean, I presume no one would take that seriously. And um, what we want to get to a place where it makes no more sense to say that of any other group,
Mm.
right? So the question is how to get there.
Yeah, I think so. One, I was going to bring this up later, but let's do it now. So, I think that I coined this term. I think in my mind, at least, racial gapology, which is just
Hmm.
the study
All
of
right.
racial gaps. And on the left, this takes the form of studying wealth gaps between blacks and whites, etc. On the right, this sometimes takes the form of studying IQ gaps between races, for example. And my sense is that all of that research, the whole category of taking one group to another, comparing some outcome, is something we should become less interested in. And
Yeah.
I think, um,
Well, the thing is, the crucial thing, and this is what was so frustrating when I touched this
mhm,
topic. Like, there's just no way. It would be an absolute miracle if you could segment the human population based on identifiable groups, that differ with respect to the genealogy and therefore the genetic character of their ancestors. I mean, you literally have human populations that lived apart significantly for thousands and thousands of years,
mhm,
so they're going to differ genetically. And then you have the differences of culture layered on top of that,
mhm,
right? So you have different groups. Take, to be non-inflammatory, take the Norwegians and the Japanese, right? Or the Norwegians and the Italians, right? These are you can look at people and tell that they, didn't come from Norway or didn't come from Japan, right?
mhm.
These people are different and they have different cultures, they have different languages. It would be an absolute miracle if everything we cared about were at the same mean level in those groups,
Yeah.
right? So we know we're going to find difference, and so to say that the mere discovery of difference is a sign of ethical pathology or that it need be politically catastrophic or problematic.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just sets you up for an endless round of conflict. I mean, we will never get beyond this. And so the question is, what is a status quo that is actually okay, right?
Mhm.
And how do we actually identify real problems in it?
Yeah, so I feel like I agree. I agree with that completely, and I've even seen data showing IQ differences between different white ethnic groups. If you they did tests in the military, and you found huge gaps sometimes between
Mm.
Irish and Poles and whatnot. And none of this stuff is intrinsically interesting to me. I don't think it is to you either. I mean, what was interesting about that whole debacle was I don't know that you even mentioned IQ and race for 15 years in your career, right? And
No,
then
no, yeah,
some
yeah.
people were painting you as quote unquote obsessed with the topic. And so I think I agree with you that these data at the moment are very inflammatory. At least some of them are. And there are two approaches to that you might want to take to that. You might say, well, we have to persuade people to understand that these differences will exist so that if they see them, they won't have they won't have this aggressive emotional reaction. I agree with that perspective, but at the same time, I think I think we should also persuade people and journalists and people who have platforms to talk less about racial differences, and that it goes for IQ and it goes for wealth. I'm talking about
Oh yeah.
scholars on both sides of the political spectrum here because, as you noted, there's a 21 cent on the dollar household income gap between white Americans of Russian descent and white Americans of French descent. If that were publicized in the New York Times, if we talked about that constantly, it could be possible that people that strongly identify with those ethnic roots, the French might think, well, what the hell is going on here? Like now I feel I'm implicated. I feel the Russians are implicated. I'm going to try to find the source of this disparity, and you have all of this social fabric, the tears in the social fabric that are happening between blacks and whites now happening, between French and Russians, and it's that seems to me like only downside, right? So
Yeah.
I think whether it's
And
wealth,
no one's looking for quotas. I mean, so the context in which we're having this conversation is one where people are people on the left are imagining that unless you have equal representation of identifiable minority groups in every field, in software engineering at Google, in cardiology and medical schools, unless you have 13% African Americans there and 50-50 male female, and um, uh, the pie chart has to look the same no matter where, no matter what sort of pie you're baking. That one that's a false expectation that just there's no way that's going to be achieved. We're not looking to do that with any of these other identifiable groups. Nobody is saying, listen, I think there's not enough French Americans at Google,
or
right?
I think 4 of the last 5 Oscar-winning directors have been Mexican, which is good. Like when I hear that
Right,
fact, I don't really
right,
have any emotional affect about it other than like, oh, that's interesting. There's something culturally that culture is producing a lot of great movie directors, and
right,
if you're gonna look at, so like I'm a musician. If I look at who has had a huge impact on world music, completely out of proportion, you're going to be talking about black people in America. Or like I've met people
right,
from Eastern Europe who heard Tupac for the first time and it just touched them completely, right? Like something about hip hop and that visceral art form just completely transcended borders and became popular in a way that many other genres of music just haven't, right? So that's a disparity of a kind. And
right.
there are infinitely many of these, and I think that you know
The problem there is that if you were going to try to understand that, I mean, that has some reason for being,
mhm,
right? I mean, obviously black culture has made a disproportionate contribution to music,
mhm.
right, in the U.S. and therefore worldwide. So how do you explain that? Well, I think the temptation on the left would be to just say that even to try to understand that it's either on some level it's a consequence of racism, or you would have to be racist to be interested in why that would be the case, right? Or it's synonymous with other opportunities having been closed to
Mm.
African Americans. And there may be some truth to that, and there may be some truth to that in with respect to any minority group that has a disproportionate level of success in one area. But I think, I mean, I'm struck by your comment that many people don't think we should want to get to a post-racial society,
Mhm.
because that seems to me to be the only firm ground here. That
Yeah.
we, I mean, the only harbor we're going to find ethically and politically is to eventually get to a place where the color of a person's skin is deeply uninteresting. I mean,
Mhm.
no more interesting than the color of their hair,
Mm.
right? So like it's just no one's saying, well, listen, I don't think there are enough blonde people at Google, right? Or working in STEM fields now. It's just no one would think that to ask the question. And if you and it actually could be true that if you if you compared the proportion of blonde people or redheaded people, it'd be easier to do, um, in society with their representation in any specific field, you'd find some anomaly. You'd find over and under representation, and uh, presumably you could tell some victimhood narrative around that,
Hmm.
or some uh, something which would seem politically uh, problematic. We have to get, just as no one would, I would presume, no one would be tempted to do that today, right?
Hmm.
It would have to seem just as fatuous. I mean, if we actually arrive at the future, I think we want to live in, it will seem just as fatuous to do that with respect to skin color or the ancestry of one's parents or anything else.
Yeah, so I want to come back to the post-racial point in a moment, but very briefly, I think people tell very convenient post hoc stories about why black people are so successful at music, for example. It's not that the music industry wasn't racist. The music industry was absolutely racist. The
Right.
NBA was racist before black people got to it. Um, it was far more a story, in my opinion, of black people not being denied on the basis of undeniable skill. If you're
Right.
talking about musical
Right.
achievement, there's just like the racism could not. It was met with so much opposition in the form of talent that it became
Yeah.
obvious to people. It's a matter
Yeah.
of human capital. Rather, I think people tell stories that are very convenient to preserve the narrative that to have their cake and eat it too. To celebrate black people where black people have achieved far more than almost any other ethnicity, and preserve the narrative that racism is ever present, and or somehow racism is still the cause of both success and failure. I think that's I don't read history in that way, but I want to come back to this point of post-racial or colorblind, because these two words, it seems to me, right now they're under attack. They've been under attack for decades. They really need a kind of PR campaign, it seems to me,
Mm.
because they have a terrible image right now. Bernie Sanders a few months ago said something like, at this point we should be looking at a politician's policies and skills rather than their skin color. Which to me, if you disagree with that statement, I almost don't even know what to think of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, but 50 years ago he would have been lauded as progressive because he was essentially quoting Martin Luther King.
Right.
What happened in 2019 is that he was mocked the next night by Stephen Colbert, right? Hardly like a pink hair
Right. I
SJW
missed that.
type, right? Like
Yeah.
he was
Uh,
mocked for being an old white guy expressing this colorblind ethic. And
yeah.
I think that the fact that that's the point we've come to say something like I try to treat people, not on the basis of skin but on the content of character, immediately marks you as naive. It's like you don't get it. That is crazy to me because most of the arguments against colorblindness are either complete caricatures or straw men or just non sequiturs. So like there's the notion that if you are, if colorblindness is a way of ignoring racial injustice, for example, this is something that gets said. Something like, I am black, I will be treated as if I'm black, I will be treated in a different way. Therefore, you can't ask me to be colorblind. You can't ask me to view my race as a trivial part of my identity because other people won't. The thing is that just is a non sequitur. Like we know there are so many ways in which you are treated differently based on your appearance, right? Like
Right.
you will treat tall people as more competent than short people. There are
Yeah.
a
Well,
million.
that's actually a great example. It never occurs to me to say this, but um, being short is a serious disadvantage. I mean, especially if you're a man, right? So, like,
Yes,
like what it, if you're, I don't
it,
know where the line is,
it's
but
great. It's great on an airplane in
yeah,
coach, but
yeah.
on a
No,
date, on a
there
first
are
date,
not
it's
many.
not.
I mean, if you actually just poll women on their bias, the variables that concern them, um, I mean, people have done these experiments where it's just like how much more money you need to earn to compensate for each inch below whatever it is, 5, 6. Um, it's crazy,
Right.
yeah, so that
But it
that is
doesn't
a
follow. It doesn't follow that you should, or that I should, as a short person, view my shortness as an important part of my identity. It just doesn't follow.
no, no, no. I mean, you just and there's no group of people telling you every day that this has to be core to how you view every moment of dissatisfaction in your life, right?
Hmm.
So everything that goes wrong between you and another person is very likely the result of their bias against your height, right? In the future, and, you could definitely. There's no question you could tune that framework up so that it
Hmm.
would always be there,
Mm.
and
And
you
I'm
would
sure there
just
are
be.
some the people in the incel community probably that do that.
Yeah, but there's
I'd imagine.
no, or being ugly, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like it's just if you have radically asymmetrical facial features, right? There is no culture, there's no society, there's no group of people who think that's an ideal of beauty,
Hmm.
right? I mean, it's just not, right? It's a so you're unlucky. I mean, being beautiful is an advantage. There's
Hmm.
just no question, and
Right.
it is a transcultural advantage,
And
right?
it
There's
just doesn't follow from how people see you that you have to see yourself that way. That's just, but yet
right,
that is one of the most common attacks on colorblindness.
and there's no, and there's also, and there's no uh, group that is militating that you need to frame everything, but with respect to this variable,
Hmm.
right? So,
Hmm.
and there could be. I mean, you could
Hmm.
easily imagine. Um, People getting together saying, "Listen, this has been intolerable. This has been this. I've been a victim of this my whole life. And there are millions of people like me, and we need to deal with this, right?" So there's just there's enough human difference that you can't compensate for that is consequential. And the truth is, any given individual is just whoever they are, right? You have whatever luck you have, right? And it's true that certain things set you up to succeed more or less effortlessly, and other things will require you to work with what is inarguably a disadvantage given the society you're in, and um, you can spend all your time. And yeah, it's not to say that there aren't norms in a society that we should want to change. I mean, yeah, clearly there are norms we want to change, or attitudes that uh, we want to push back against. But the reality is that even if we just scrubbed our politics and our institutions and our social norms of anything that looked like a kind of indefensible bias, you would still have bias,
Hmm.
right? You would still have people based on their evolved preferences and their cultural preferences that you can't help but form, who are more attracted to some people than other people, right? And so so that's already an inequality that's just you could complain about. You would still have a range. You'll have a bell curve of talents over any conceivable talent, right? Um, Whether you can quantify it or not, you'll recognize that some people are better at certain things than others. Again, I was speaking about individuals, um, and you as an individual don't the fact that you might be part of some identifiable group that has a mean sense of humor on the sense of humor scale at 7, right? And some other group gets a mean of 4, right? I mean, if you have one group that has a mean sense of humor on some sense of humor scale we could come up with of 7, and you have another group that has a mean sense of humor of 4, and you happen to be in the group that gets a mean of 7, that doesn't mean that you're funny, right? I mean, you are as funny as you are,
Hmm.
right? And you never derive a real group benefit or disadvantage. It's provided we live in a society where there's enough equality of opportunity where you can move to your strengths, and you can try to correct your weaknesses. So
Hmm.
obviously we want the opportunities for education and medical care and every good thing that's supportive of people from the moment they leave the womb, we want this spread around as much as we can, and we want to correct for any inequalities there. But um, the idea that a sane politics depends on us getting some. I mean, it's hard to imagine what an equality of outcome would even mean. You know,
Mm,
there's just too many variables
mm,
to consider. But
mm,
getting to some equality of outcome everywhere you look, um, it just could never happen,
mhm.
right?
Yeah, I agree with that, and yeah, I want to come back to color blindness, though, and look at some of the other arguments that are leveled against it. I think one is just a straw man, which is, when someone says, quote, "I don't see color," right? Usually, if they're psychologically normal person, they don't literally mean that they're colorblind, as in they
Right.
can't distinguish. But what they mean is, I aspire to be the type of person who treats people equally, regardless of how they look,
Yeah.
right? And yet, I think it was Howard Schultz who said, "I don't see color," and was ridiculed for this, perhaps rightly, because that is a bizarre way of phrasing it. Taken literally, it can't be true. But you know, shouldn't we give him the benefit of the doubt, in the sense that he's a CEO of Starbucks? He probably knows that he probably doesn't mean he does not literally see color, but really any expression that gestures in that direction now.
Well, what you want to get to, and many people can honestly confess, is a an experience where it's not salient in any ethically or politically interesting way, right? I mean, it's like you don't. Again, I mean, hair color is a great example. Like I see hair color, right? Obviously, it's like if you ask me what color someone's hair is, I can tell you, but I'm never going through life thinking, oh, well, she's blonde or she's brunette. That's got to sort of I got to take that into account,
Mhm.
in the way I feel about this person. It has zero charge ever, right? And wouldn't that be the world we want to live in, right? I don't understand someone who thinks we wouldn't want to live in that world.
What they say is, they never say straight up, "I wouldn't want to live in that world." What they say is, that is naive. That is a way of ignoring racial injustice. Don't you realize that, to extend the analogy, the hair color you're born with determines your place in society? You will be treated as a blonde or brunette. Therefore, it does matter. That's what they say, right? Which, again, it just strikes me as a non sequitur, right? Racism is precisely a failure of color blindness. It is a lack of color blindness, right? It's
Right.
not. Color blindness is the antidote to racism, and as a matter of intellectual history, the people who promoted the colorblind ideas, we are talking A. Philip Randolph, the original leader of the March on Washington movement in the 1940s.
Mm.
Bayard Rustin, person who organized the famous March on Washington in '63. Martin Luther King, right? The notion of reverse racism, which is, if I were to say something against you as a white guy, Sam's a white guy, he just doesn't get it, he's a straight white male, whatever, right? The
Right.
notion that I am being racist to you is actually ridiculed on the left right now, because,
Yeah.
at least certainly in
Impossible.
academic circles, it's seen as, prejudice plus power, and you have power as a white guy, therefore I don't have power, so I can't really be racist towards you. And people who cry reverse racism are, it basically elicits an eye roll. These are just conservative trolls. They don't really get it. They don't care about racism. They're just trolling, essentially. If you go back and read A. Philip Randolph, the founder of the original March on Washington movement, he literally used the phrase racism in reverse as something to warn
Yeah.
against black people participating in it, right? This is not an idea that came out of, like, 4chan. That's kind of how it's portrayed right now, but it's just not true as a matter of intellectual history. And I think that people try to retell history in a way, or conveniently ignore certain things so as to make their case seem more plausible today.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is another example where history is not helpful. I mean, the etymology of a phrase uh, or the history of its usage shouldn't constrain us in the present, right? I mean, so like you take the shibboleth on the left and in African American circles that like the most clueless thing you can say in response to a charge of racism is, wait a minute, some of my best friends are black, right? Like that's not only not exculpatory, that is just you have doubly condemned yourself. I think that's total bullshit. Now, there may be a historical reason why this came to be. I'm not actually up on the history. It could have been that the first usage of some of my best friends are black could have been, literally out of the mouth of an obvious racist who was just, making a joke I don't actually know where the phrase was first spoken. Perhaps you do. But in the present, when you actually look at what is entailed in overcoming racism, and you admit that you're in the presence of someone for whom it's true to say that some of his best friends are black, if that doesn't mark a stage of progress, and probably final progress, on the path out of having a racist problem. I mean, it's not to say that there couldn't be some residue of racial bias or charge to race in general, given the level of its expression in our society. But the idea that you I mean, this even happens with people who are, having interracial marriages, right? They still, like, even that is insufficient to get out from under the shadow. I don't know what world you think we're going to get to if that's not the important increment of progress.
And the thing is, it's not even sufficient sometimes within the relationships themselves. Because, I mean, I know 2 or 3 examples of kids, friends of mine, who go to Columbia or Barnard and are themselves a part of a black-white interracial couple that have been dating for years. And,
Right.
I think it's a testament to the power of ideas that I have multiple different stories, which I won't tell in too much detail, of the black half of that partnership accusing the white half of racism, right?
Right.
The same person that they sleep in the same bed as every night, knows everything about their history, is their closest partner in life. But also just being black at Columbia and Barnard in this environment, you are not inevitably, as I am proof of, but the tug of social justice thinking is so strong that you can. I've seen the conflict even within relationships, where like you're having a fight with your partner that is about a completely non-racial issue, just a typical relationship fight, and then because you're black and it's 2019 and you exist in this very niche subculture in which this sort of move is allowed, you accuse your partner of being clueless as a white person, not just being clueless as your partner, right? I've seen this happen over and over again, and this stuff is invisible unless you're friends with the people, but it's a testament to the power of ideas that are academic to trickle down into social relationships and whatnot. But
there's also the experience that I've had with people who for whom the color of their skin is really not very salient, where you actually can become colorblind to a degree that does prop up Howard Schultz a little bit. Like I mean, I was always struck in when I hang out with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, right? She's like, she is black, but I mean, she's Somali, but she did not have any of the African American experience, right? I mean, she just came from Somalia to Europe, and now she's in America. But it's just like she's from another planet when you're talking about these issues, and it is, I mean, this is a conversation I haven't had with her. I'm sure she has some of the black experience, whatever that is, even though it's completely unsupported on her own side, just as she moves through life. But I mean, it is very easy to forget the color of her skin around her because she seems to have forgotten the
Hmm.
color of her skin. I mean, so
That.
there's a
Hmm.
post-racial experience you have with her,
Hmm.
which represents a fairly bright line to me of just what is possible,
Yep.
and why that couldn't be possible by the millions. I don't know.
I've seen that attitude replicated with many black immigrant friends of mine. I have two pretty close friends from Jamaica, very, very dark
Right.
skinned. One of them, Camille Foster, has a great podcast called The Fifth Column that I
Yeah, that's
highly
great.
recommend.
Yeah.
He actually does not identify as black. And it's so
Right.
interesting
He
translating.
must get some pain over
He
that,
gets
I
a
would
lot of
imagine.
pain. I mean, he
Yeah.
articulates, he defends that position as well as it could possibly be defended. And he is one of the sanest people that I know. So,
Yeah.
people, coming from a context like descended from slavery context, the context I learned about the African American experience was more reminiscent of the way black Americans tend to rather than black immigrants. The first time I heard that, I thought, "Oh God, he just doesn't get it. He doesn't get what it is here, what race is here." And then I had another
Right.
Jamaican friend, Desiree Campbell, who does great YouTube videos, who essentially had the same exact perspective. And I'm thinking there is something in the water here, the culture, how we talk about race, that is pathological, and we don't even realize how pathological it is until we see what's possible from an outside perspective. And
Right.
you know,
I mean,
uh,
I have the analogous experience with Judaism,
mm,
right? I mean, it's a slightly different thing, but because it's not quite as visible, although I'm always amazed that I can be visibly picked out as Jewish. I've had this experience several times where occasionally Orthodox Jews will show up in a Starbucks, whatever, to just find a convert. And I mean, literally, they'll pick me out of a crowd of there's like 30 white people. The guy will just make a beeline to my table, right? Um, uh, so it is visible in some sense, but I feel totally unimplicated in I mean, anti-Semitism is a thing, right? It's clearly a problem of some order. I have been the target of it, at least online. I've noticed, people attacking me as a Jew. It is completely meaningless to me, right? Like so, but there's no question that I could make it meaningful. Like if I was identified as a Jew, right? And it's not that I'm aloof to the history of anti-Semitism. I've spent a lot of time studying the Holocaust, and I'm totally aware that this could become a significant problem again, and is a problem in Europe to a significant degree even now. But it's just personally the difference between uh, feeling this as feeling personally implicated in this and not
mm,
is enormous.
mm,
And it's just I'm in a very privileged position where I don't have to, it's like I'm not being denied jobs because I'm Jewish. I mean, I'm
mm,
not, there's not, it's not that level of a problem,
mhm.
but it's yeah, on some level, it's an accident of culture that I'm not more, I'm not seeing more things through that lens. And, so what we want to engineer some happy accidents of culture that serve to break this spell. And the one thing I don't see, in fact, the one thing I'm fairly certain can't be true, is uh, there's just no way that caring more and more about race and racial difference, making it more and more salient in the way that someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates does, there's no way that is the optimal strategy to
Mm,
actually getting past it,
mm.
right? It seems like absolutely the wrong algorithm to be running.
Yeah, I think you and I are similar in that, I've experienced racism. I've, people, I have stories, so to speak, not the worst stories by
Right.
any stretch of the imagination, but I don't see my identity as deeply implicated in when I think of anti-black racism, and I try to view it as objectively. I try to when I'm trying to assess the amount of racism in America, I try to think as an objective person, not quote unquote as a black man. Despite the fact that I have some stories I could tell. it's interesting. I think you'll appreciate this. Briefly, how much time do you have? Do you have a stop?
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Whatever you need.
So you and I both meditate, and we go. I think I found out through your blog actually about the Insight Meditation Society, where I've been on three retreats, and I highly recommend it. Mindfulness has been a huge tool for me in my life, especially in the context of being publicly shamed, which perhaps we can touch on briefly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I went on a retreat. Yeah, I think I went on a retreat maybe 2 years ago, and I think I sent you an email talking about the way in which social justice politics was beginning to infiltrate in the retreat. So they have this welcome packet, and right at the beginning of the welcome packet, before the information about where the defibrillator was a list of all the ways in which white people are privileged, right? And I just saw this, and
that blows my mind.
I'm thinking, like, I'm about to not speak for a week for the first time in my life. And be kind of completely
You're already
alone.
guilty of white privilege.
Exactly. Not only do I have the immense privilege of doing this, but it is the least of my concerns that I'm going to experience racism here at a Buddhist meditation retreat, right?
But also, given the explicit goal of meditation is to overcome concepts of all kinds, and especially self-identity and the very notion of the self. Right. The idea that you're going to ramify this superficial level of difference in the information packet. It's just
it was.
I hit Joseph pretty hard once I received that email. He got an earful.
I'm afraid you're gonna have a reason to hit him a little bit harder because it's gotten worse.
I'm happy to. Oh yeah.
I went on a retreat in March and it was great. I just want to be very clear here. I love Insight Meditation Society. It is one of the most.
It's the best place to practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Now they have, wait for it, people of color sits. One sit a day that is exclusively for people of color.
Oh my God! So on a retreat, white people are told they shouldn't come to that sitting.
So there's one sit in the evening where if I want to, as a black man, I can go to a separate room that is reserved for people of color, no white people allowed, and rather than do the group sit with everyone in the meditation hall, just do it with like me, one Chinese woman, and an Indian guy. And the idea being, because there's no white people, that I'll have a better practice, right? And there's so many layers of irony to that. Like, one is, what do I really have in common with this one Chinese woman? Do I have more in common with her based on being a, quote, POC, this kind of weird umbrella category? And secondly, we're all in here studying a philosophy invented by an Indian guy. And if we can't achieve the colorblind ideal here, at this like extremely hippie, open-minded, like we have completely lost. That is the feeling I came away with. And I actually did not go to the sit because I felt I would be going in bad faith, and I was in such a unironic, non-writerly space. I was just trying to, so basically it offered many opportunities for observing my own frustration and letting it pass through me. But
so I recall they were having people of color retreats, right? Which I could sort of understand the justification for, but the idea that you would have a special sitting within a retreat that's open to the general public. I mean, they're like women's retreats too, right? Which I can also understand the rationale for, but and teenager retreats, but the idea that you would need a room where white people are not allowed in order to make everyone else feel comfortable enough in their practice, that is Joseph will hear from me on that topic.
How many black people demanded this as well?
Yeah,
I don't know.
The truth is, he doesn't have the power to change this. I mean, it's not North Korea over there. He's dealing with a board that is, I'm sure, very woke. But I will complain nonetheless.
Yeah, thank you. Before I let you go,
as a sign of my white privilege, that's the worst thing I've heard all day.
Believe me, it does not make you as mad as it made me on retreat. I was fuming, but I was in the perfect position to deal with my anger constructively by breathing, focusing on the breath. Before I let you go, I want to talk briefly about public shaming. This is a topic that that I've kind of been forced to think a lot about by being part of a public shaming. You've I think weathered many public shamings. I feel you're kind of a veteran of the territory,
Mhm.
and you've also
Yeah.
thought a lot about it in addition to having experienced it firsthand. And I guess I want to ask, what have you learned firsthand from dealing with the public shaming from a psychological point of view, and from a societal point of view? What do you think we can do to push back against the just the constant cycle of public shamings that are leaving just careers destroyed,
Mm.
families destroyed? We rarely see what happens on the underbelly of a public shaming, but just very, very briefly, like I'm having to have conversations with my sisters and father about security, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that is something that I literally I broke into tears the other day just thinking about that, because these are decisions I've made that are now implicating my family members because people with platforms have named them. And that is, and I'm frankly one of the milder cases of public shaming, right? There are people
Right.
who have gotten it far worse. So I put that to you.
Yeah. Well, there are many pieces to it. I mean, so the security piece is separable because it's not necessarily the result of public shaming, although
Mm,
that could be, part of it. I mean,
mm,
just as you become more visible, you'll attract all kinds of unwanted attention, and that comes with the territory. I mean, and there are intelligent moves you can make to mitigate that. But um, I mean, some of the more troubling uh, attention you could get is just might not be ideological at all. It just might be, from crazy people, right? Someone who's infatuated with you, or somebody who thinks you're sending them messages or whatever. And that just every person who has a significant public profile has some level of that going on, and that's just um, it can be a problem, but it's definitely separable from the kind of mob like scapegoating and shaming we're seeing, especially on social media. Um, I've stepped back from. I never used Facebook or really any other platform apart from just kind of as a marketing tool. I'll post if I released an episode of my podcast today. We posted it. I assume we posted it on Facebook, but I never see what's happening on Facebook. But I actually use Twitter, and I used to kind of get into the weeds with what was coming back at me,
mm,
and I would certainly notice when somebody with a blue check mark would you know dishonestly circulate something that was designed to smear me, or and I've pulled back like 98% from Twitter at this point. I mean, occasionally I'm using it more and more the way I've always used Facebook. I mean, it's just I push something out there. Occasionally, I look at my feed. I look at the people who I'm following just to see, what articles they're recommending, and it does kind of curate my news diet to some degree. But I see much less of what's coming back at me. I mean, I've really cut it by a factor of probably almost 100. So, on some level, I could be getting publicly shamed and not even know about it
mm,
at this point. And I've, very consciously built my platform now where I'm as immune as a person can be, I think, to the consequences of anything getting any significant momentum out there. So, if I had a job at CNN, or if I had a job at a university, if I was a research scientist at a university, and I was, we just had this conversation about race, and I, just went on record saying that, the defense, some of my best friends are black. That should be a good defense, right? Um, who knows what's going to happen with that, right? Someone will re-edit this podcast to make it even sound worse,
mm,
right? I mean, they do that with my podcast. Um, I'm actually, for the most part, I mean, I don't, who knows how bad it could get. I mean, we're now getting into the area of deep fakes where, you're going to have a video of you saying things you absolutely never said, and, a million people could believe it. But I'm at a point now where I basically feel beyond caring about any of that stuff. And so I'd recommend you doing whatever you need to do to get to that place, because psychologically it's a much happier place to be. Now, there is a there's a spot on this map of immunity to this kind of thing that I think you don't want to occupy, which is a kind of I mean, it's possible to build your own echo chamber such that you're only hearing from your fans and you're getting captured by your fans, right? So you become. I mean, there are people who I see this happen to. I mean, these are like someone like Candace Owens, right? I don't know Candace. She can say, for significant stretches of time, she can seem totally reasonable. Then you catch her on some other topic like global warming, and she can seem, quite deranged. And no doubt, there's a lot she said that I'm unaware of, but there's no feedback that's going to prove valid enough so that she's going to course correct on the basis of it, right? And her audience, like it's almost like it's a fairly Trumpian exercise, where it's like once there's a certain subset of fans that you care about, and those are the only ones you care about. You're never going to hear when you're actually doing things that are in a larger context obviously idiotic or wrong or unethical, or and so I'm very conscious in how I relate to my own audience. I mean, now speaking specifically about like my podcast audience, of having kind of trained my audience to care about my being coherent and ethical and honest, and my being disposed to reconcile apparent contradictions in things I've said or done, if that ever happens. So I feel like I have an audience that is actually very quick to push back against me. I really don't have an echo chamber of an audience, and I consciously go against my audience when I feel like there's any significant subset of them that is wrong on a topic. Like when I discovered that some percentage of my audience supported Trump, that didn't cause me to shut up about Trump. That caused me to go harder against him, So I think that the thing you don't want to do is decide, all right, I'm just going to listen to feedback I like, right? You can't get into that spot, and it's easy to do that in this kind of forum, because you'll just select for it, especially if you become. And the other thing I certainly wouldn't want to see happen to you is, you shouldn't be someone who just focuses on this particular culture war issue. I mean, you have such a wide range of interests and such an obvious skill set that there's going to, if any of this matters, you're going to get to a place where you've said everything you have to say about race, and you're just not going to. It's just there's other things to talk about, right? So it's going to come up not once a week or once an episode. It's going to come up once a year, right, or once every 5 years. It's sort of what's happened to me on the topic of really atheism. Just the conflict between religion and science. I mean, at a certain point that was my thing, and then there was kind of a side, light on, focusing uniquely on Islam, right? And I still have those things to say for the most part. My opinions haven't changed. The world hasn't fundamentally changed, but I have said more or less everything I can think to say on those topics, and they're not intrinsically interesting to me. And so I've just moved on. And it's not that I won't say, if there's a terrorist attack in a major capital, and it's jihadists and nobody's making sense, and I have a platform, I might revisit the issue. But again, that'll be just a specific moment of me just saying the thing I've said 1,000 times and then moving on. And I would assume that's going to happen for you, maybe sooner than you think on this topic. And then I think you just want to, so much of what comes back at you is so obviously in bad faith that even to interact with it is demeaning, right? I mean, you essentially have to um, I mean, this is a lesson I've been very slow to learn. I mean, in the beginning, I felt like I had to push back on this stuff, especially if it's coming from some prominent person. But if it's in sufficiently bad faith, there's just no, I mean, in my world, the Glenn Greenwalds and the Reza Aslans of the world, you just can't. To push back is to have, um, uh, yeah, there's something intrinsically demeaning about it, and there's no real outcome there. I mean, the people, what you'll begin to find is the people who followed your argument in the first place are with you, and they see you as, at minimum, boring them
Mm.
by feeling like you need to put out this fire, um, or getting your hands dirty unnecessarily. And then the people who are incapable of following your argument or are so wedded to their ideology that they simply won't, you're not going to win them over,
Mm.
right? And
Yeah, I feel like I've in the wake of my testimony before Congress, I've had something of a transformation in how I'm approaching this. So I don't know. I think I have a similar disposition to you in the sense that I'm very concerned with the feedback I get because I'm afraid I got something wrong, and I get things wrong sometimes. And
right,
sometimes
yeah,
there's an excellent correction to one of my views that shows up in my Twitter notifications. So I felt that I have to look at it
yeah,
just
yeah,
in order to keep myself honest. And a lot of my fans are, I think, similar to your fans. Even if they generally agree with me, will be quick to point out if I get something wrong, and I really value that. So I felt that I have to look at my notifications, and then the other 90% of what I get is, a lot of it is ad hominem, and I think for a long time I sort of tried to pretend that none of it got to me, but I
mm,
think the truth is all of it kind of gets to me. And
yeah,
I just read this book, So You've Been Publicly Shamed, by John
yeah,
Ronson.
yeah. That's great.
And one of his observations after looking at many different case studies is that oftentimes the subject or object of a public shaming becomes numb to all these emotions, right? Like you choose or you switch into a mode where you're just not feeling anything. And that really resonated with me because as I left Congress, I don't know if anyone got this on video, but it was me, my sister, my girlfriend, my friend, and there were just a crowd of people yelling the word shame at us at point blank range
Mm,
at the top of their voices,
wow.
and my sister was yelling back, and people asked me
Is
how
that video everywhere? Is that video anywhere? Or is it because I only saw what you were getting as you were testifying, and even that was fairly colorful. But
yeah.
is the rest captured anywhere?
Somebody did take this video, and it was so deep in my Twitter mentions during when I was getting kind of shamed that
Mm,
I didn't think to like bookmark this to watch later.
right,
But
right.
it's somewhere deep in the internet. But people ask me, what did you feel at that moment? And the truth is, I felt nothing. I felt
Yeah,
I was in complete kind of Zen warrior mode. Like, get out of this building and leave. I didn't feel
yeah,
fear or shame or any. It was just nothing. And I think a lot of my reaction to the to the public shaming has been of that character, and it's been, at the same time as I've sort of started to allow myself to feel normal human emotions about being the object
mm,
of a public shaming campaign, I've like in the past 10 days been off of Twitter almost completely. And
right.
I don't, it seems, well, I go on once a day for maybe 3 minutes just to see if the algorithm
Yeah,
has pushed up
yeah,
any great articles, and then that's it.
right. Yeah,
And
yeah. No, that's kind of like me.
yeah.
Um, well, no, and I understand. There's definitely a time to pay attention to what's coming back at you, just on the off chance that some error is being found, and like actually this happened to me recently. Um, you probably followed the Andy No Antifa drama where he was attacked by Antifa,
Hmm.
and I said something on my podcast about it in the housekeeping, and I mentioned, I mentioned this old man, this other video of an old man getting hit with a crowbar, um, and I had just seen video of just an old man getting hit with a crowbar by Antifa, but it turns out there was video of him previously, with a telescopic baton, fighting Antifa,
Mm.
and then, finally, he gets overwhelmed by crowbar wielding thugs, and uh, so somewhat, I just happened to look at, I pushed this out. I just happened to look at my ad mentions, and someone said you might want to revise this bit about the old man because he's not as innocent as you made out. It doesn't really
Mm.
change your argument.
Mhm.
So, but that was like, I wouldn't have found that for myself, right? I'm not scouring the internet for other videos of this incident that I already thought I saw, right? So that's very useful and perhaps inevitable, but uh, you don't want to live in your Twitter feed
Yeah.
at all because it is. I mean, the other thing is you can clean it up by you can decide to only hear from people who are following you
Mhm.
and have a confirmed email address and who don't have a Twitter egg bio photo. I mean, you can check a few of those boxes and that cleans it up immensely.
Mhm.
But uh, it's toxic to be thinking about what other people think of you
Mhm.
all the time, right? So it's like, and so if you can just live your life so as to not be continually reminded of this, chatter about you, um, that's got to be better.
Oh
Unless
yeah.
unless there really is an opportunity to course correct because you've taken a position that was ill considered or I mean that's the other thing about you being publicly shamed. If you haven't done something even remotely shameful, in fact, if your actual impulses are ethical and born of your concern for, real problems in this world, it's like there's no place for it to land. It's like what is for me in my, criticism of Islam and me spelling out the linkage between specific doctrines and jihadism and me worrying about this in the aftermath of a terrorist attack, right? When I have someone on Twitter of, even if they have, 2 million followers, call me a racist because I've said something about, negative about, uh, you know, uh, Islam in this context. Um, I mean, one is a non sequitur. So, I mean, it doesn't land for that reason because, Islam is not a race. But two, I know internally that my concern about Islam has absolutely nothing to do with race, right? I mean, it's because it has, I'm in total solidarity with the Reformed Muslims and the ex-Muslims who share the same racial characteristics that most Muslims do the world over, if you're going to generalize in that way. But it's just race is orthogonal to the problem, right?
Mhm.
So you have what you're often met with bad, in any bad faith criticism, you're met with a very energetic, kind of laser beam intensity animus directed at you that is not actually directed at you, right? It's
Mhm.
like it's not you. It's not. That's not. It's not based on the actual content of your ideas, your actual motives, the real way you feel about people, the things you care about. So it's like they have some fictional version of you that they hate, right? And that they're determined to keep in play, right? With these people, there's no amount of clarification that will get them to recognize, oh, actually, yeah, this was mistargeted, right? That's not actually what you're about or what you were thinking or why you were doing it. No, that never happens. So um, it does. It's not. It is a very different experience than actually doing something wrong.
Mm.
That you internally feel is wrong, or for the wrong reasons, uh, and then having that same spotlight shined on it. And
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, that's an experience I haven't had. So like I've had. I guess we should. This is the first time I've even thought about this, but we should we should probably differentiate. You know, public shaming that is has no place to land because the shamee recognizes that it's totally unwarranted, and then public shaming that really does you did something wrong, you
Mhm.
you did something that's either actually is humiliating or embarrassing or for which you feel like the need to apologize, and people hate you for it and they're not accepting your apology, and
Mhm.
that's a very different world to be in.
I want to go back briefly to a point you made about the Andy No
Uh-huh.
affair in Portland recently. I think you said something along the lines of, this is the kind of thing that probably could not have happened if not for Twitter. Right? Like the
Right.
whole, like
Yeah, like
people wouldn't have
everything about
known.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, people would
Yeah.
not have known necessarily who Andy No was. They wouldn't, the whole thing, that one of the things that I'm also rethinking is my relationship to not just consuming Twitter, but to consuming daily news in general. And
Yeah.
there was this recent study that Yasha Monk wrote about in the Atlantic, which showed that basically any level of news consumption correlates with your being too alarmed about the opposing party. Like if you watch more
Mm.
news, you're more likely to think that
Yeah.
Republicans are far more radical than they are, and vice versa. And
Right.
so I read that, and then I also, yesterday I saw Aziz Ansari's stand-up, his new Netflix special. I don't know if you've seen it,
No, I haven't seen it yet.
but he does one social experiment in the special where he essentially makes up a fake culture war controversy. Right? He makes up a
Hmm.
story about a pizza that had pepperoni in the shape of a swastika on it.
Right.
And half of people who saw the pizza thought it was a swastika. The other half of people thought it just looked like a normal pizza pie. And he asked people in the audience, "Do you guys remember this story?" It was in the New York Times and Washington Post. Clap if you think it looked like a swastika. Some people clap. Clap if you think it looked like a normal pizza. Other people clapped. He even said, "Oh, you just clapped? You don't think it looked like a swastika, sir?" And he said, "Yeah, no, I remember that. I don't think it. I think it's just a bunch of PC garbage. And
Yeah.
he just, and then he reveals that he completely made the story up,
Right.
and it made me really, it shocked me because I'm someone who consumes a lot of news, not because I love it intrinsically, but because I feel I should be informed, and I'm
Yeah.
questioning the degree to which my being informed. I'm questioning the consequences of news consumption. Essentially, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Uh, yeah, I'm going through a similar reevaluation on my side too, because I mean, one, there's so much to keep up with, and if you're reading a lot of news every day, it's in zero sum contest with everything else you want to be reading, right? You're no longer reading books.
Mm,
I was noticing that it was getting harder to read books
same.
uh,
Yeah.
because I was reading so many articles, and I felt kind of a personal and professional commitment to just at least surveying all the news that day. Like I would turn every page of the New York Times just to make sure I had at least seen all the headlines. Um, I'm not doing that so much anymore because it's a little bit like we've sort of lost the weekly magazine as a framework through which to get news. But if you were, it used to be that you could read Time magazine once a week and be fairly sure that if a story was significant, it would survive a weekly news cycle, right? And to some degree, I'm kind of resetting with that. Like it's like if this thing is actually big, it's going to be around in a few days. People are still going to be talking about it in a few days. Um, Unfortunately, that's not quite true with Trump because there's like no atrocity large enough to survive a 48-hour news cycle because he's going to do something else. But um, yeah, I can see. I mean that's a surprising result that Yasha uh, tweeted about, but it doesn't really surprise me. But yeah, there's a linear relationship between being informed journalistically, i.e., reading the news, and being and misconceiving the level of radicalization of the other party.
Hmm.
Um, it's it's depressing, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. Well, on that depressing note, I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much, Sam, for being
Don't
my
read the
first
news. Yeah.
guest here at Conversations with Coleman, and I hope to have
Oh,
you
a pleasure.
back. And
Yeah. Well, I'll come back. We'll talk about the philosophy of mind or something that
oh
is
yeah,
truly beyond identity.
excellent.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
Cool. Well, good luck with it, Coleman.
Thanks, Sam.